So 10 years ago, I was a lot younger, and this is not me, that's David Hannemeyer Hansen, who looks a lot like that from that angle, still today. He's Danish, he doesn't age. And it was awesome, and it still is today, but you could build a web app even if you knew nothing. It would make HTML. If the HTML would go into the browser, it would look fantastic. But 10 years ago, how to deploy a Rails app was known only to 3 monks living on a mountain. Well, it wasn't a mountain near me. I don't know where they were. But that kind of was, I guess that's in the winning in production led to lesson number 1, which is you can't win in production if you're not in production. And it's interesting, I started blogging a year later, and you'd have to really look back and see that none of my blog posts talk about ever running things in production, because I couldn't. For years. It was really embarrassing. And I now feel confident I can tell you that 10 years later. So, there are barriers to winning in production, and one is if you don't know how to do it. And even now, I don't really think the Rails code base tells you what to do. It's like a small part of a much bigger stack that you know nothing about. You're too busy being distracted by, React or whatever other the JavaScript thing sits on top of it all. And back 10 years ago, there was the question that we would ask at Ruby conferences and Rails conferences like, hey, hands up, who gets paid to do this? Which is synonymous with, are we allowed to? Now, 7 years ago, I was in a pub, which is where Ruby things happen in Sydney. And Tim Lucas is just a wonderful human being, and he, the founder of BuildKite, if you haven't used it, you should try. And he introduced us to a phenomenon that was coming out of America, which is where all phenomenons come from. Tim was the first person to tell me about Donald Trump, and he introduced us not to Git. Git was new and we were learning Git, but to pushing apps into this thing called Heroku, and which was fantastic because your app was in production from day one. We had consulting customers, and they were happy because they could see their app. They didn't have to come around and look at your laptop anymore, which is where all good Rails apps live and die. And it was free, and that was handy. And for different reasons, the barriers to longer-term production, which again, what is production? It's a 5-year, 10-year journey. It's like a child. It's not just day one. It's no joke to this. It's more of a. I've always felt that Rails new command, when it generates your app, at the end in yellow should say, "Warning, you've just created a production app. Did you mean to?" Because it seems very harmless, but it's a commitment. Or perhaps a different plugin would say, "Did you mean to? Would you like a reminder to update your LinkedIn profile a year from now when you want to get out of this job?" Technical, like when something didn't work on Heroku, and this is, I love those people, so this is more just an example, but when something didn't work, there's nothing you could do about it. A, it was proprietary, you didn't know how it all worked, and B, it was locked, and so sometimes you would grow off. The are we allowed to was still a problem, because back then running on someone else's infrastructure was many web users or companies wouldn't let you do that. And even if you did, at scale, the pricing started to become a problem for some people. And there's others, but I mean, it was still a wonderful experience. And so 5.5 years ago, I went to America, moved the family all at short notice, and because my wife had once said to me, "Nick, we will go wherever you need to for work." Apparently America wasn't one of those places, but we went and met a vast variety of people. Very diverse group over there. He's so funny. America and Donald Trump. And so I went to Engineering, and because back 5.5 years ago, Engineer was, they were one of the hugest sponsors of Ruby and Rails, a lot of conferences, and a lot of us probably, even if we don't use them, thankful for their existence. And but they had some of the biggest apps and the biggest companies who were successful as businesses, successful in production, were on Engineer, and I wanted to see a piece of that. And it was really, and there was a lot of learning lessons. But at the moment, in this particular talk, I want to talk about the things that were negative. And in this case, it was one of the things that a couple of things. One was CI pipelines becoming more and more possible as people built other things than Jenkins. But we couldn't really make it easy because even though you could have big production environments, you couldn't really have small development environments and small staging environments. So people either didn't do it or did it on Heroku or did it on their laptop, which is, for most people, not like production. Though one of the funniest tweets I ever saw was a joke, but it was on Twitter, so it's obviously a joke, was sysadmin going to a developer saying this doesn't work. He says, it does work, great. Back up your email, your laptop's going into production. So take responsibility for getting it running. One of the other challenges we had at Engineer was we gave everyone chef access and root to machines so they could extend the platform, which sounds innocent enough until you realize you have no idea in what ways they're extending the platform. And there were certainly some contention points, Nginx configuration being one of them, where everyone had an opinion about what should happen there. And it made it very hard for Engineer to evolve the platform with confidence without worrying about what happens to 2,000 customers. And so a bunch of ideas around. And over time, I felt the Heroku model of container-based abstraction was a cleaner one than the full VM. Another idea was you wanted to encourage people to get on that platform from day one. That the platform, and this goes from both those two stories, of Heroku and Engineered, was if developers deploying on day one, they're learning to live with the constraints from day one. That MySQL is not on the same machine, ever. That Mongo is not anywhere in your life. These constraints. Those sorts of quality production choices. So while I was living in America, I got invited to VMware, the Palo Alto campus, where they have the Cloud Foundry group. They'd released something a year before. It was kind of interesting. But this year, they were adding container support. They were going to release a tool called Bosch. No, they were the two really interesting things. And so the container support came in the concept of a thing called Warden, which unfortunately died somewhat because it was invented at VMware. If you can imagine, VMware, a hypervisor company, someone inventing containers, and VMware management didn't quite know what to do about that. Now, it turns out the containers generate more work, generate more VMs, and they would have sold more licenses, but it kind of got hidden off. A year later, this little company called DocCloud released a thing called Docker, and now we're all very excited about containers. So nonetheless, this story of containers has sort of come along, and it's very exciting, both for operations people and for developers. But I started to see some ideas coming out of Cloud Foundry that I started to believe that was the future more so than the things I'd seen in the past. One, it was entirely open source. The fact that they even open sourced Bosch, which is how they were deploying it, I thought was fantastic. It meant that you could see how it worked, fix it, etc. You could run it in your own data center, which was important for big institutions who wanted to have data centers. If you're a CIO, it's on your list of things to do to start a data center. All right, that's what the job, it's in the title somewhere. Financial, you could start from the low end of open source plus consulting, or Pivotal. Enrico mentioned he works at Pivotal. The Cloud Foundry group, they have a proprietary product. Bluemix, both hosted and an on-prem. And that means that regardless of how you install it, how you operate it, it can have the same deployment experience from day one of month one for the next 5 years. And I believe that's super valuable. As the team changes, it's the same constraints, it's the same ideas. you can build to that platform as a developer. You don't have to not know how production looks. You are responsible for your app fitting in production through the entire, and that is the core tenet for my belief about winning in production. So I left, I got a new visa, that's important, and so I got to start this thing called Stark and Wayne, and it's like, as more of a symptom of people may not have heard of Cloud Foundry, but to us, Cloud Foundry is huge. We grew to 25 people, a bunch of our customers last year. I was looking across their environments, because I can, and over 5,000 apps were deployed. Now, some of them are the same code base, just running in various pipelines of different lengths. And this is the thing, the people living on top can make up their own CI system, their own orchestration, as long as they want, as diverse and integrated, because Cloud Foundry or Heroku, any of those sorts of platforms experiences give them a very consistent API to talk to. So it's pretty exciting. And the types of problem space that they go after are just invisible to you, to me, until you get to go into their building and find out what they're working on. To me, the fact that Cloud Foundry was getting moved into a foundation was important. It meant that if VMware, which became pivotal, you got bored, or decided they didn't want to do Cloud Foundry anymore, it wasn't just going to be shut down and killed. There were other companies investing in this thing. And so, as a consultancy, and as someone who wanted to sort of spruik something that I believed in, this became important. And we got a new logo, which is always important. You know something's important when someone says, it's time for a new logo. You go, yeah, it's time for a new logo. So everything was going fantastic. So I got to move back to Australia. Yeah. Now, that's not my house. But it is the best visualization of how good my internet is. From a long way away, I didn't quite understand what you're all complaining about with this national broadband network. But when someone says the solution to one of my problems is to, quote, wait for NBN, I understand where network rage comes from. I'm not sure if that's a real phrase, but I feel like hurting people if that's equivalent of road rage. So let's deploy a Rails app to this thing. I've talked about Cloud Foundry in the past to people, and I get very excited about it. And then at the end, they say, could you have at least showed us what it was? So I have learned from that lesson and that feedback. And we're all about feedback, so here we go. Now, this deployment of Cloud Foundry is on, I've got a vSphere cluster. It's somewhere in Europe. It's in a VPN, so just as an example of it all being locked off. It's got Cloud Foundry, it's got MySQL, it's got an AWS access, and I'm not going to pretend to type. All right. You'd probably catch on when it sort of does the transition. So let's make a Rails app. This is pretty exciting. Hadn't made one for a little while. So this is Rails 5 app. You have to make a controller. There's no default homepage anymore, so let's make a little controller. I love generators. You'll take different things away from Rails. I wrote a thing called RubyGen once because I love generators so much. All right. Honey, I'm home. I wrote that, and later on I thought, I wonder if that fits into the code of conduct. Hope so. And anyway, if someone's typing. It's me, by the way. You can tell from the accent of how I type. Rails apps, I think it's fantastic from a production. WebRec is no longer the default, since that was a terrible default. And Puma is fantastic. Puma is like the new version of Mongo that Evan Phoenix worked on for the last 5 years or so. So deploying, it's as simple as one command. I've already targeted my Cloud Foundry, and I'm just going to push it. And all it does is push up the source code, creates a route, I'm not sure which one it is, a thing with the URL, and that will just work, and it will find wherever my containers are. Once the code goes up, it's going to look across a bunch of default build packs, very similar to Heroku model. Exactly the same, to be fair. Many of the build packs are Heroku build packs, and figures out that it's a Ruby one. And to be fair, I think this is simpler than doing it on your laptop. If you remember how hard it is to get Ruby installed the first time. if you don't remember, you haven't taught anyone to use Ruby for a while. It's very hard to justify Ruby after you've watched them, just let someone try to install Ruby their way, and you'll find all the ways that are wrong. Never let a friend install a software language with apt-get installed. It's a fair life skill. All right, so it's figured out, and it's even guessed how to run it. At the top of the screen are some warnings, which I think are fantastic. A platform that teaches you, the developer, how to perhaps curate your app better for production is just a wonderful thing. And so then the app's working. And literally, that was it. And we could do that all day long from day one through, for the next 5, 10 years. So let's look at the warnings. A couple of ideas there. One, like Heroku, the Rails 12-factor app gem, 12-factor gem. What that does is instead of logging to log files, it logs to standard out and standard error, which means that Cloud Foundry can pipe it back to you. And it suggests that you create an explicit proc file. Yes, it guessed what to do, but being explicit is far better in production because A, you've communicated to your coworkers what you want, and you've communicated to the platform what you want. The build pack is an evolving thing, and they might change it, and it might not work for you in the future. So be explicit. And off we go. And pushing the app a second time is as simple as the first time. And this is why I don't really demonstrate it. It's like, well, what have I demonstrated? You can push apps and it deploys. Like, I guess that's really difficult. But it was 10 years ago, and 7 years ago until I saw Heroku for the first time. The fact this is my own, on my own machines, I'm just so excited. And I know how it all works, which I'm not going to tell you. That just certainly spoil it. It's like, I don't even have a good metaphor for that. I don't know how to cook. So, down the bottom, you can see that it's given some very large defaults. A gig of RAM, a gig of disk is more than you're ever going to need. So let's scale down to what we do need, and let's scale up to the number of instances. I think it's very important, and it's a suggestion to always run more than one. Because that way, you as a developer will get to see your application where you don't have any chance of shared state. No shared memory, where you've kept something in memory accidentally, and it works for you on your laptop. Remember that one? So run multiple instances so you find those things early. Very hard to test. And so very easy for us in development to scale up and down, and then that's exactly what's going to go out into production. It has a whole logging thing. So your app containers are going to run in a big bowl of machines, sloshing around with other people's app containers, happily sitting next to them. And so logging becomes a super important attribute. And so you can, based on just the app name and the space you're in, pull out your old logs and sit there streaming away any new logs that come in. Yeah, okay, so I could have cut that bit out. We run the, just give it another go, gets another request come through. And so you get the requests from the app tier of what your Rails app printed out to standard out, and from the routing mesh. And so you can see all that stuff. And that's kind of good. I mean, yes, it's great. You can do it in your browser, in your terminal. But I like to send this stuff off to a logging system as quickly as possible. And so paper trails is, I like it. But in your own environment, you might run Elk or Splunk or whatever, but this works for me. They make it pretty easy for Cloud Foundry apps. And there's your sort of syslog endpoint. There is a command to run, which on day one, you won't know what it is. Luckily, they wrote some documentation. God bless them. And let's just acknowledge my excellent copy and pasting skills. I'm available for any copy and pasting you may need. Not early in the morning, I've got work to do. But later in the afternoon, I'm a lot more free. Most of my staff live in New York, and it's terrible time overlap. It's really quite horrendous. But I reckon I could manage pasting in the late afternoon. So binding services, this is a Cloud Foundry concept of attaching an app to another thing. And once we restart the app, our app doesn't need to know anything about the logging infrastructure. This is what platforms are for. The logs will automatically get streamed off to somewhere. And thanks to the magic of syslog protocol and that whole subsystem, Papertrail picks it up and prints it out. And this is what's important. You as a developer are now experiencing what your application looks like in production. And with empathy, something that you've learned about all day, you will think, I wonder how I can make these logs look nicer. So you can filter by different things. What else could I, the developer, put in my logs to make these logs make sense? Right? What's the story these logs are going to tell? When any feature, any story, and you estimate it, and you do the work that you do to make apps, make sure you've got a buffer in there for what are we going to do, what's the logs going to look like? What story do our logs tell when this feature is being implemented? And you might go and use something like the log raids gem to flatten the logs out, for example. But it's part of your team's responsibility. What can you give to the ops people, to Tier 1, Tier 2 support, so that you don't get phone calls in the middle of the night? That's an excellent idea. What story can you tell? All right. So, and this is why I think platforms and day 1 being the same as day, as month 60 is super important. So let's go and add a database. This particular Cloud Foundry has got a MySQL and an S3 broker. So let's play with the MySQL one, which you'd only do because you don't have Postgres. If you were thinking of using Mongo, I hope you've learned a lesson. And if you'd like me to yell at you later on for using Mongo, feel free. No, look, it's a fantastic in-memory cache. And so we've created the database. We told Cloud Foundry, go and create us one. It went off, ultimately told MySQL, and MySQL exists. And now we probably should update the app to actually talk to MySQL. I'm pretty lazy. I'm just going to run the generators again and copy and paste the good bits in. No one would create a Rails app without the database. Rails app's got to have a database. But nonetheless, this is how I went about it. And now, for your viewing pleasure, I'm going to use the scaffold generator, which you may never have used in Anger before because it has no purpose, except for demos. So I was very excited to use this little feature. And we get a database migration, which you would run on your laptop and feel very good about yourself. But the question is, how do we get this migration running on our platform as we go through the pipeline? And I'm going to show you how, because I'm a good bloke. Push the app. Yeah. Need some app-pushing music. All right, let's go to our post endpoint that we got. And terrible failure. I always like the nerve error message. Anyway, and you can see, because we have logs set up straight away where our error is, if you're going to do microservices, you might feel more encouraged to do microservices if you have a platform, because you can get your logs meshed in nicely, you can tell a story. All right, so let's go and we can use the CF SSH command. It's a lot like the normal SSH command. You can pass a command in, but I'm going to run it sort of as a human. Transactional system administration. It's a fancy phrase, so mucking around. And I run the migrations. But now I'm not on my laptop. I'm in a container inside vSphere in Europe, and in a place that I would never otherwise have access to that MySQL database. And so that's working. Now, you would script that. That CF SSH command can be scripted. You would script everything, because scripting's awesome. That's what CI is for. A little robot for your company. Who doesn't love robots? I mean, OK, they get a bad rap in the press and Hollywood. But now, staying inside that container and wrapping up here, you can see environment variables. And like Heroku, many of you may have used Heroku, but a lot of the people I talk to have never heard of it. So environment variables are the way we do configuration. Do not sort of push configuration files, because then you've got to have different configuration files for your pipeline. Whereas environment variables are both great for tweaking a pipeline, different places along the pipeline, or giving some different way to your ops people and different, or to the CI system itself to toggle attributes of the app. And it's all part of, look, there's hundreds of commands, but I think these are the sort of the core ideas. And to give you the idea that if you've got a platform, whether it's Cloud Foundry or any of the new things coming out, perhaps on top of Kubernetes, or if you're using Heroku, you get to have this production experience from day one. And if you acknowledge it and own it, you are going to have, you're going to be part of this whole winning in production idea, as opposed to just being Ruby developers, which is not what you're paid for. You're paid a lot, hopefully, to help your company win in production. And we've found a lot of success with people who are sitting on top of a platform like this. OK, so winning in development. To me, there's these three goals. One is to elevate developers, to put them as high up on the stack as possible to solve real problems, and to not be solving things that anyone else could have solved, that your company didn't have to. Adrian Crockford sort of wrote the parts on the right-hand side come from Adrian Crockford, who used to work at Netflix. Don't do undifferentiated heavy lifting. Turbocharge the developers. Unless you work for a monopoly, and monopolies are awesome, that's why they're illegal. But if you work in the normal marketplace, speed wins. And your ability to iterate and ship over and over again is going to help you against your competitors. And foster empathy amongst developers. If we can help developers care about the support people, care about the users, and not just high-minded care, but literally think about them in the stories. As part of the acceptance of a story, what do the logs look like? As part of the acceptance of the story, did it affect production in any way? You can have that. To finish up, I think it's inappropriate in this day and age to finish any talk related to ops, DevOps, production, without using the Docker word. You might think I don't know what I'm talking about. You might think, I'm pretty sure I would have mentioned Docker by now, so whoever said that's wrong and weren't listening. So to finish up, yes, you can. I'm not going to show it to you because you might actually do it. But if your company's looking for how to do Docker, at least with Cloud Foundry, you can get those Docker containers up and have a good time, and then get back to winning in production. All right, thank you very much.